CHAPTER I of the Markets of Paris. The Markets of Paris by Émile Zola. CHAPTER I. Despair and Hunger. Through the profound silence and loneliness of the deserted avenue, the wagons of the market gardeners rolled slowly toward Paris. The measured rhythm of their wheels re-echoed from the facades of the sleeping houses on either side, behind the confused outlines of their sheltering trees. A cart loaded with cabbages and another with peas at the Pont de Neuilly joined 8 more, piled with carrots and turnips coming down from Nanterre. The horses moved on slowly by themselves, with heads well down. The drivers slept under the striped covering, holding the reins lightly in their hands. A gas jet would flash down occasionally on the shining nails of a stout shoe, or the blue sleeve of a blouse, light up the red carrots and white turnips, and bring out the vivid green of the peas and the cabbages. From all the roads came the dull, continuous sound of wheels, lulling the black town to a deeper sleep as they bore onward through the silence and darkness this vast supply of food. Balthasar, the horse belonging to Madame François, a stout, heavy animal, was at the head of the line. He walked on at a steady pace, though half asleep, gently moving his ears, when all at once, at the head of la Rue de Longchamp, he started, and stood still, firmly planted on his 4 feet. The other animals did the same, and the whole line came to a halt, amidst the oaths of the awakened wagoners. Madame François, leaning against a board among her vegetables, looked out, but saw nothing, for the scanty light of the small lantern fell only on Balthasar's shining flanks. "Well, mother, why don't you get on?" called out one of the men, getting upon his knees among the turnips. "It is only some drunken man." She leaned out of her wagon and saw on the right, almost under the feet of the horse, a black mass lying across the road. "I don't propose to drive over any one," she said, as she clambered over the wheel. It was a man lying face downwards in the dust. He seemed to be of a most extraordinary length, as thin as a withered branch. It was a miracle that Balthasar had not broken him in two with one blow of his foot. Madame François thought the man dead. She knelt down by his side, took his hand, and felt that it was warm. "Poor fellow!" she said gently. But the wagoners were growing impatient, and the one who had previously spoken now said, in his thick voice, "Give him a push, mother. He is pretty full, that's all the trouble. Roll him over into the gutter." The man opened his eyes. He looked at Madame François in a wild sort of way, but did not move. She, too, thought him drunk. "You must not lie there," she said. "You will be run over. Where are you going?" "I do not know," he replied in a low voice. Then he made an effort, and added, "I was going into the city. I fell, and I do not know." She saw him more distinctly now. He was indeed most deplorable in appearance, with his black and threadbare coat and pantaloons clinging closely to his emaciated form. His cap, also of black cloth, pulled down over his brows, showed 2 bright, brown eyes of singular sweetness in a weary, anxious face. Madame François thought him too thin to be a drinking man. "And where were you going after you get into Paris?" she asked. He did not instantly reply. He was evidently annoyed at this interrogatory. He hesitated, and then said slowly, "I was going to the Halles." He struggled to his feet with infinite difficulty, and made an effort to continue his way. The market woman saw him stagger, and grasped the side of the wagon. "You are tired?" "Yes, very tired," he replied. Then she adopted a rough, authoritative tone, and said, "Get into the wagon at once. You are making us all lose our time. I am going to the Halles, and I will take you with my vegetables." And as he refused, she lifted him with her stout, strong arms, and threw him among her turnips and carrots. "Don't be a fool, my good man. Don't I tell you that I am going to the Halles? Go to sleep, and I will wake you when we get there." She climbed to her seat, shook her reins a little, as she gathered them up, and Balthasar calmly resumed his slow march, the other wagons following. The reverberations began anew, and drivers fell asleep once more. The one who had spoken stretched himself out and muttered, "I wonder if we are to pick up all the drunken men. If that is your idea, mother, you will have enough to do." The wagons rolled on, the horses going as they pleased. The man whom Madame Fran9ois had rescued lay at full length among the vegetables, half covered by the spreading carrot tops. He clutched the side of the wagon with weak, loose fingers, lest he should be thrown out by a sudden jolt, and looked out at the two interminable lines of gas lights, which afar off melted into other lights. I am from Nanterre. I am called Madame Fran9ois," said the market woman, after a long silence. Since my old man died I go myself every morning to the Halles. 'Tis hard work, but I must grin and bear it, I suppose. And you?" My name is Florent, and I come from a great distance," answered the unknown, with some hesitation. I beg your pardon, but I am so very tired that it hurts me to speak." He was evidently determined not to talk, and she said no more, but let the lines fall a little on Balthasar's back, as the animal knew every step of the way. Florent, with his eyes riveted on the lights of Paris, thought of the history he hoped to conceal. He had escaped from Cayenne, where he had been sent after these dark December days. He had wandered for 2 years in Guyana, eager to return to his native land, but afraid of the Imperial police. Could it be that at last he saw the dear city for which he had so long pined? He would hide himself there and live peaceably. The police would have no reason to suspect him; to them he was as good as dead. He thought of his arrival at Havre with 15 francs tied up in the corner of his handkerchief. At Rouen he left the railroad, as he had but 30 sous remaining; and at Vernon bought some bread with his last 2 sous. After that he could remember nothing. He thought he must have slept several hours in a ditch. A gendarme had asked for his papers. He remembered all this in a vague sort of way. His head was dizzy, for he had come from Vernon without a mouthful, clutching at times at the leaves of the hedges and chewing them in despair. But he walked on in spite of cramps, which nearly cut him in two, drawn on by that image of Paris waiting for him behind the distant horizon. When he reached Courbevoie, the night was very dark. Paris, like a streak of light falling athwart the blackness, appeared to him severe and retreating. As he crossed the Pont de Neuilly he leaned over the parapet and saw the Seine rolling below in inky blackness between the dark banks. From that point his progress was upward. The avenue seemed absolutely endless to him. The 100 of leagues he had toiled over became as nothing. It was this last part of the road which drove him to desperation. Never would he reach that summit crowned by those lights. The avenue, with its tall trees and lower houses, its gray pavement streaked with shadows, the dark gaps made by the cross streets, the silence and the blackness, the yellow flaming gas lights at regular distances between the only suggestion of life, weighed him down. Florent could not go on. The avenue lengthened as he walked, and Paris was still farther off. It seemed to him that the very gas lights were dancing to and fro. He tottered and fell, an inert mass, on the sidewalk. And now he was lying on this soft, fresh verdure. He raised his head a little, to see a wider extent of the luminous mist that rose above the distant roofs. He was going on without any exertion of his own, and his only pain now arose from the pangs of hunger, which had again awakened within him, and were gnawing like wild animals. The strong and penetrating odor of the carrots troubled him. He turned over on his face and pressed his stomach against those piles of food, hoping to still his cravings. And behind were 9 more huge wagons, with their mountains of cabbages and peas, their piles of artichokes and lettuce, celery and leeks. He wondered if they would fall upon him and stifle him with their abundance while he lay dying of hunger. There was a sudden stop — a great noise of voices. They had reached the barrier and the custom house, people were examining the wagons. Florent entered Paris among the carrots, sound asleep. Hallo, my good man," cried Madame Fran9ois, and as he did not move, she reached over and shook him. He struggled up. He was no longer hungry. He was dizzy and faint. The woman made him get down, and then said : You will help me unload, won't you?" He helped her, but a stout man, with a cane and felt hat, with a metal badge on his left breast, became angry, and knocked his cane against the pavement. Come, come, make haste. That will never do. You have 4 mètres, haven't you?" He handed a paper to Madame Fran9ois, who drew from a linen bag the necessary sous, and the man ordered the wagon to move on a little, and then turned his grumbling to the next. The market woman took Balthasar by the bridle and pushed him back until the wheels ran up to the sidewalk. She proceeded to mark her 4 mètres on the pavement with small bundles of straw, then lifted the board at the back, and begged Florent to hand her out the vegetables bunch by bunch. She arranged them methodically and with marvelous deftness, so that the turnip, carrot and beet tops framed her little square with a mass of verdure, and the whole looked in the shadow like a rich carpet. When Florent handed her a huge bundle of parsley, the last thing in the wagon, she asked him yet one other service. Would you be so kind as to watch my merchandise while I put up my horse? I have only 2 steps to go — just round the corner to the Compas d'Or in la Rue Montorgueil." He assured her that she might make her mind easy — he had as lief stay there as not, until her return. The fact was that he preferred to stay still, for hunger began to gnaw at his vitals the moment he moved. He sat down and leaned against a pile of cabbages, telling her she might be as long as she pleased. His head was dizzy, and he did not feel quite certain where he was. As soon as September comes, the early morning is dark, and lanterns were moving about, held in invisible hands. He was at the end of a wide street, with which he was perfectly unfamiliar. 10 steps away it was all thick darkness, and he could see no farther than the merchandise over which he was keeping guard. Confused gray masses occupied the center of the street, and he heard the sound of cattle moving and breathing loud. A quiet, imperative call — the fall of a piece of wood on an iron chain on the stone pavement, the dull thud of a wagon backed up against the curbstone — filled the air with vague suggestions of a formidable awakening near at hand — an awakening with which all this darkness already shivered. Florent, turning his head, saw on the other side of the pile of cabbages a man sound asleep, with his head on a basket of prunes. Nearer still was a lad of 12 curled up between 2 piles of chicory. But he fixed his eyes in dull surprise on 2 gigantic covered sheds on either side the street, whose roofs seemed to expand as he gazed. His mind slightly wandered, and he began to dream of an endless palace, light and airy, brilliantly illuminated. He saw the slender pillars and the overhanging roof. He tried to count the succession of halls crowded with people. He turned his head aside, restless and uneasy, and suddenly beheld the illuminated clock face of Saint Eustache, and the gray mass of the church. He was excessively astonished at finding himself in this locality. Madame Fran9ois now appeared. She was disputing with a man who carried a sack on his shoulders, and wished to buy her carrots at 1 sou a bunch. But there is no sense in it, Lacaille. You will sell them again for 4 or 5 sous to the Parisians — you know that as well as I do. You can have them for 2 sous if you say so." And as the man went away, she said : That is really too much. He won't find any carrots at a sou, but he is tipsy. There is no use in talking about him. He will be back soon enough, too." She was speaking to Florent, and then she took a seat by his side. Tell me," she said, if you have been a long time away from Paris. For if you have, this market is new to you. The Halles have been built not more than 5 years. All this building on your right is devoted to flowers and fruits. Next comes the fish and the poultry, and beyond, the vegetables, cheese, butter, etc. There are 6 buildings on this side of the street, and on the other 4, tripe and meat and all that sort of thing. It is an enormous place, and hideously cold in winter. They say that there are 2 more divisions to be built, and a number of houses to be torn down, all the way from the wheat market. You know where that is?" No," answered Florent. I am quite a stranger. But what is the name of this wide street just before us?" It is a new street — la Rue du Pont Neuf, which runs from the Seine. There is la Rue Montmartre, and there is la Rue Montorgueil." She rose as she spoke, seeing a woman leaning over her turnips. Good morning, Mother Chantemesse," she said, in a friendly way. Florent looked at la Rue Montorgueil. It was there that he had been arrested by armed police on the night of the 4th of December. He was walking along the street about 2 o'clock, feeling a certain contempt for all these soldiers that the Elys6e had sent forth, when all at once, these soldiers swept the streets with a discharge of musketry. He himself fell at the corner of la Rue Vivienne. He knew no more — the crowd trampled upon him and the noise was deafening. When all was again silent he tried to rise to his feet again. The body of a young girl lay across him. She wore a rose colored hat, and her shawl had slipped off, showing a muslin waist all tucks and inserting. 2 musket balls had gone through her throat, and when he lifted the poor thing his hands were drenched with blood. Then he rushed away, mad with horror, and wandered until night, seeing nothing but this young girl with her pale face, and her great blue eyes wide open, in which he read a great surprise at death coming to her so suddenly. He was very timid, and, although 30, rarely looked into a woman's face, and yet this one would haunt him all the rest of his life. That evening, without knowing how he got there, he found himself at a wine shop in la Rue Montorgueil. The men were all talking of erecting some barricades. He went with them and assisted them in tearing up the paving stones, and then seated himself, for he was weary with the excitement of the day. He had not even a knife in his belt, and his head was bare. He bade his friends to tell him if the soldiers came, as he was ready to do his share of fighting. About 11 o'clock he fell asleep. But his dreams were haunted by those blue eyes and the 2 round holes in that white throat. When he awoke he was in the grasp of 4 armed men. His friends had taken flight. The police wished to strangle him at once when they saw that he had blood on his hands. It was the blood of the blue-eyed girl. Florent, absorbed in these recollections, watched the illuminated dial in the tower of Saint Eustache, but he saw neither figures nor hands. It was nearly 4 o'clock. The Halles was not yet well astir. Madame Chantemesse still bargained with Madame Fran9ois over the price of the turnips; and Florent recalled what he had seen in that very spot. 5 dead bodies had lain there, 5 poor fellows who had been taken at a barricade in la Rue Greneta. He had not been shot down at the same time and place, merely because the men who took him prisoner had swords instead of guns. He was taken to a station near by, where his description was filed. Hands covered with blood when arrested. Very dangerous. He was dragged from station to station. At each the same words were written down. He was handcuffed and treated as if he were a madman. At one place some tipsy soldiers wished to shoot him, but fortunately orders came that all prisoners should be carried before the Prefect. The next day he was placed in a casemate of the Phare de Bicêtre. That day he suffered from hunger for the first time in his life, and eagerly snatched the mouthfuls of food which were thrown into him as to a wild beast. When he appeared before the judge, without any testimony in his favor, or counsel to defend him, he was accused of belonging to a secret society; and when he swore that this was not true, the judge, with a portentous frown, drew out the ominous bit of paper. Hands covered with blood when arrested. Very dangerous. This was enough. He was tried and condemned at the end of 6 weeks. In January a jailer came to him in the middle of the night, and took him down to a courtyard where there were at least 400 other prisoners. And in another hour the first detachment of these were sent into exile, wearing handcuffs, and marching between 2 files of soldiers with loaded guns. They crossed the Pont d'Austerlitz, following the line of the Boulevards, and reached the Havre station. It was a gay and festive night of the Carnival. The windows of all the restaurants on the Boulevard were blazing with lights; and near la Rue Vivienne, just where the dead girl had lain, Florent saw some masked women in a carriage, who were much disgusted at being detained by all these forçats, who would never get past. From Paris to Havre, the prisoners had not a mouthful of bread nor a drop of water. No rations had been distributed before they started. They were forgotten. They had nothing to eat for 36 hours — not until they were on board the frigate Canada. As he looked back, he could not remember that he had had enough to eat once since then. He was nothing but skin and bone, and now he returned to Paris, to find her rolling in abundance. He had come back to her borne upon a cart heaped high with vegetables. That Carnival night on which he had left Paris had apparently lasted until now, for 7 long years, and it seemed to him that all the glitter and prodigality of that night, as he remembered it, had blossomed out into this enormous market. Mother Chantemesse decided to buy 12 bunches of turnips. She held them in her apron, and still stood talking. When she at last departed, Madame Fran9ois went back and took a seat by Florent, saying : The poor old woman is over 70. I was a child when she bought turnips of my father, and she has not a relative in the world, nor a soul to do a thing for her, except a girl she has picked up somewhere. The old woman gets along somehow, though, and even makes her 40 sous per day. But, dear me, I wonder how she can stay all the time in these Paris streets. They would kill me." And as Florent did not speak, she said : You have relations here, I suppose?" He did not seem to hear her. He was uneasy and suspicious. His head was full of stories of police agents and detectives watching at all the corners of the streets — of women selling the secrets they tore from certain poor devils. He looked at Madame Fran9ois' kindly face, framed in a black and yellow handkerchief tied under her chin. She was apparently about 35, rather large, and masculine, but handsome, from her abundant health and out of doors life, softened by the womanly tenderness which spoke from out her black eyes. She went on, not in the least offended by the silence of her companion. I have a nephew in Paris, but he has turned out badly. I suppose your parents will be surprised to see you. Ah ! It is a nice thing to go home when one is sure of a welcome, is it not?" She did not take her eyes from him as she spoke. She was compassionating his excessive thinness, but detecting a gentleman under his shabby clothing. She did not dare to offer him the piece of silver which was burning her hand. At last she said timidly : If, in the meantime, you should happen to want anything —" But he refused with uneasy pride. He said he had all he needed, and that he knew where to go. She seemed quite pleased, and said over and over again, as if to reassure herself: Well, then, you have only to wait for daylight." A great bell above Florent's head now began to ring, with a slow and regular sound. Carts were rolling up. The shouts of the drivers, and the snapping of their whips, the grinding of the gravel, beneath the wheels and the feet of the animals, momentarily increased. The wagons could now advance only a rod or two at a time, so great was the crowd. All along la Rue du Pont Neuf the carts stood against the sidewalk and were unloading, the horses with their heads close together. Florent took a special interest in an enormous load of cabbages on which shone a gas light, bringing out the green of the large leaves, looking like wrinkled velvet. A little peasant girl of 16, wearing a blue jacket and a close fitting cap, stood upright in the cart among the cabbages, and threw them one by one to some person standing in the shadow below. The girl was sometimes almost hidden among the verdure. Then her pretty rosy face peeped out again. She laughed, and the cabbages recommenced their flight between the gas light and Florent. He counted them mechanically, and was sorry when the cart was empty. The vegetables were so arranged on the pavement that the vendors could circulate among them. The lights from the glancing lanterns shone on a bundle of artichokes, on the delicate green of lettuce, the deep orange of the carrots, and the ivory whiteness of turnips. All these brilliant colors were repeated again and again, until the whole ground was like a delicious mosaic. The crowd was rapidly increasing. Customers were moving in every direction. A loud voice called: Nice chicory! Fresh chicory!" The proprietors of the vegetable stalls — women with their white caps, and fichus knotted loosely, and with their skirts pinned up carefully — were making their purchases, which porters were carrying to the stalls. And there was much noisy disputing over a sou. Florent was infinitely astonished at the calmness of these hale countrywomen, with their sunburned faces and Madras handkerchiefs, in the presence of these voluble Parisians. Behind him was the fruit market. Rows of low, shallow baskets stood covered with cloth or straw, while an odor of over ripe plums filled the air. A low, sweet voice compelled him to look around. He saw a charmingly pretty woman, small and dark, bargaining with a man. Well, then, Marcel, will you sell them for 100 sous?" The man made no reply, and the young woman waited fully 5 minutes, when she said: 100 sous for this basket, and 4 francs for the other, make 9 that I owe you." Another silence. What, then, am I to give you?" 10 francs, just as I told you. And Jules — what have you done with him, La Sarriette?" The woman laughed, and said as she showed a handful of money : Bless your heart! Jules is asleep.
He vows that men were not made to work."
She paid him, and took the 2 baskets into the fruit market, which had just opened. Through its covered streets a crowd was constantly passing, while at the Porte Saint Eustache the bakers and proprietors of other small shops were just taking down their shutters, and their windows lighted by gas made little red spots among the gray houses. Florent looked to the left, way down la Rue Montorgueil, and saw the glossy brown loaves in the window, and fancied that he could even smell them. It was now 4:30. All this time Madame Fran9ois was getting rid of her merchandise, and had nothing left but some bunches of carrots, when Lacaille appeared again with his sack. Will you take a sou for them now?" he asked.
I was sure you would be back," answered the market woman, quietly. You can have all that are left — only 17 bunches." That makes 17 sous."
No, 34." They finally agreed on 25, as Madame Fran9ois was in a hurry to get away, and Lacaille went off quite triumphant, with his carrots in his sack.
Old miser," she said to Florent. He always waits until the last sound of the bell to buy his 4 sous worth of stuff. Ah, these Parisians ! They bargain their eyes out for 2 liards, and then go and drink up every sou they own at the first wine shop." When Madame Fran9ois spoke of Paris, she was full of irony and contempt. She seemed to regard it as a most contemptible, as well as ridiculous city, in which she would not consent to spend a night. And now," she said, with a sigh of relief, as she again seated herself by Florent, now I can go." Florent looked away, for he had committed a theft. He had picked up a carrot and held it concealed in his hand. The parsley and celery emitted such fragrance that his hunger became unendurable. I am going away," repeated Madame Fran9ois. She was interested in this stranger, and was certain that he was suffering. She made him new proffers of assistance, but he refused them all with a certain sharpness in his voice. He rose to his feet to prove that he was quite able to go on his way, and as she turned away her head, he put a piece of the carrot in his mouth. He held it there a moment, as she looked him once more in the face, with several new questions. He nodded, and ate the carrot slowly. CHAPTER II Part 2 of The Markets of Paris by Émile Zola. Despair and Hunger, Part 2. The market woman turned to depart, when a full voice called out: Good morning, Madame Fran9ois." It was a thin fellow who spoke, a thin fellow with a big head and big bones, a delicate nose, and small bright eyes. He wore a hat of black felt, shabby and out of shape. He was closely buttoned up in an immense overcoat, once light chestnut in tint, on which the rain had left huge greenish blotches. Round shouldered, and trembling in a nervous way that was probably habitual, he stood with his legs a little apart, his stout laced shoes and blue stockings fully exposed to view by his very short pantaloons. Good morning, Monsieur Claude," replied the market woman, gayly. I waited for you Monday, and as you did not come, I took care of your canvas, and fastened it up on my wall in my bedroom." You are very kind, Madame Fran9ois." I will come some day and finish my sketch. Monday it was impossible." Has your great prune tree put out all its leaves yet?" Oh, yes, indeed." Well, then, I will put it in the corner of my picture. It will do well there next the poultry house." I have been thinking about it all the week. The vegetables are superb this morning. I got up early only to see the effect of the sunrise on these cabbages." I am off," said the market woman. I hope to see you soon, Monsieur Claude." She hesitated, and then added, presenting Florent to the young painter: Look here. This gentleman has just come back from a long journey, and feels like a stranger in Paris. Give him some help, can't you?" And she walked off, quite content in leaving the two men together. Claude looked at Florent with interest. His long oval face, with its uncertain expression, struck him as quite original. The market woman's introduction was quite enough, and with the ease of a person accustomed to all sorts of odd adventures and rencontres, he said quietly: I will go with you, but where are you going?" Florent was not altogether pleased, but one question had been on his lips for the last hour, and he determined to risk it. He hastily said: Does la Rue Pirouette still exist?" To be sure," answered the painter. And a curious corner of old Paris it is, too, with its crooked turns and pot bellied houses. I made a sketch there that was not very bad. When you come to my studio I will show it to you. Is that where you want to go?" Florent, quite comforted by hearing that la Rue Pirouette still existed, said no, that he was not going there. All his distrust was awakened by Claude's persistence, who answered gayly : "Well, never mind. Let us go all the same to la Rue Pirouette. Come, it is only 2 steps off." There was nothing to be said, and Florent was compelled to yield, and they strode off. Along the sidewalk were gigantic piles of cauliflowers arranged with surprising regularity. Their tender green among the coarser outer leaves gave them the look of flowers, or of a succession of bridal bouquets. Claude stopped before them with a little exclamation of admiration. A gas light still burned on the corner of la Rue Pirouette. The houses were precisely as the painter had described them, pot bellied and elbowing each other, although some few were quite the contrary, and looked as if they were about to fall on their noses. The gas fell full on one which was very white and fresh, as if it had recently been done up, while others were tottering and covered with green mold. Florent stood still at the corner of la Rue Mondétour, in front of the house next to the corner on the left. The 3 floors looked as if all the inhabitants were still sound asleep. The small white curtains were drawn close, while high up in an attic window a light came and went. But the shop on the lower floor seemed to cause Florent an extraordinary emotion. It was a place where only cooked vegetables were sold. At the back bright tins glittered, and on the counter stood chicory and spinach smoking in small earthen dishes, where they were piled up in smooth hillocks. This sight seemed to astonish Florent. He looked up at the name Godebceuf on a red sign, and stood aghast, with the air of a man to whom some great misfortune has arrived. Meanwhile the attic window was opened. A little old woman leaned out, looked at the sky, then at the Halles, and then into the distance. "Hallo! Mademoiselle Saget is early to day," said Claude, turning toward his companion. "I once had an aunt living in that house, which is a perfect nest for scandal. Ah! the Mehudens are moving. I see their lights on the second floor." Florent was about to ask a question, but suddenly changed his mind, for he did not feel quite easy each time he looked the little artist full in the face. He therefore listened while the other talked of the Mehudens. They were fishwomen. The oldest was superb. The youngest looked like one of Murillo's Virgins, calm and fair among her carp and her eels. And then the little painter added, angrily, that Murillo was not such a wonderful artist after all. He suddenly stood still in the middle of the street. "Well," he asked, "do you want to go to the very end?" "I don't care where I go," said Florent. "Lead on. I will follow." As they turned out of la Rue Pirouette, a voice called Claude from the depths of a wine shop in the corner. Claude went in, dragging Florent with him. The shutters were taken down from only one window, the gas was burning, and the air close and stifling. A dirty towel and the cards of the previous evening lay forgotten on the table, fluttering in the breeze which came in at the open door, and mingled with the stale odor of wine and tobacco. The proprietor, Lebigre, was waiting on his customers in his shirt sleeves, and with his big face white with sleep. Men were drinking at the counter, coughing and spitting, swallowing raw brandy with the hope of arousing themselves to their day's work. Florent saw Lacaille, the man who had bargained for the carrots, and was now discussing with a comrade the price of potatoes. When he had emptied his glass, he went into a small room at the back of the shop with Lebigre. "What will you take?" said Claude to Florent. The little painter had shaken hands, and he came in with the young man who had called him, a handsome young fellow of about 22, wearing a moustache on his otherwise well shaven face, which smiled from under the wide brim of a hat well dusted with chalk. Claude called him Alexander, tapped him familiarly on the arm, and asked when they should go to Charentonneau, and they said something about a jolly boating party on which they had been together, and of a delicious rabbit stew they had enjoyed in the evening. "Well, what will you take?" repeated Claude. Florent looked at the counter in some doubt. At one end were bowls of punch and hot wine kept hot over gas. He said he would take something warm. Monsieur Lebigre handed over the counter 3 glasses of punch. A basketful of hot rolls stood on the counter.
But as the other two men did not take any, Florent refrained, although he felt the hot punch fall into his empty stomach like so much melted lead. It was Alexander who paid. A good fellow is this Alexander," said Claude, when they left the wine shop. He is excellent company in the country. I never saw such a gymnast. His muscles are something extraordinary. He has posed for me naked several times in the open air. Now shall we take a turn through the Halles?" Florent followed him. At the end of la Rue Rambuteau a bright light announced the coming of the day. The roar of the crowd in the market was constantly increasing. The two men turned into one of those covered streets between the fish and the poultry market. Florent lifted his eyes to the high roof, with its crossed timbers of shining wood, and then, as he looked about him, it seemed to him that he was in some big town with its distinct quartiers — its squares and its streets — all put under a huge shed out of some whim on a rainy day. There was a perfect forest of pillars, and innumerable trellises of iron. Some of the divisions were as yet unoccupied, although the gas was lighted throughout. Women were hurrying through the fish market, and laying out their wares on the marble tables. The hurry and noise was spreading from the poorer quarters where the cabbages were bought and sold at 4 o'clock in the morning, to the stalls where pheasants and chickens were sold to the wealthy at 8 o'clock. All along the sidewalks were established petty market gardeners from the outskirts of the city, with their bunches of vegetables and dainty baskets of fruit. Carts were constantly driving in under the vaulted roof. Two of these stood in such a way that Florent was obliged to wait for them to move before he could pass, and he saw the men take down heavy bags which were wet and smelt of sea moss and contained shell fish, as did huge boxes with cross bars of wood, which were brought by the railroads daily from the ocean. Then came large yellow wagons with colored lanterns, laden with cheese, eggs and butter. Claude was delighted with all this tumult. He was transfixed by an effect of light on a group of men in blouses. At last they struggled through all this confusion, and found themselves in a quieter spot filled with delicious fragrance. They were among cut flowers. Women were seated on either side of them, with their square baskets full of roses, violets and marguerites. A lighted candle brought out a perfect melody of color. The pale sweetness of the marguerite, and the vivid crimson of the dahlias, and the flesh-like tints of the roses. There is nothing sweeter or more spring-like than this odor of flowers coming to one after the smell of fish and the pestilential odor of cheese and butter. Claude and Florent loitered along among the flowers, and stopped with some curiosity before the women who sold bundles of ferns and of vine leaves methodically bound together — 25 in a bundle. Then they turned into another quiet street, which was almost deserted, where their steps resounded as in a church. They found there, harnessed to a wagon about as large as a wheelbarrow, the smallest donkey that was ever seen. The creature began to bray as soon as the two men came in sight, and with such prolonged vigor that the vast roof of the Halles fairly reverberated. Horses neighed in response, and these sounds were repeated again and again, until lost in the distance. Opposite was the Rue Berger, with its wide open stalls, heaped up with baskets and with fruit. Near by stood a fiacre, in which they caught a glimpse of a lady lounging in the corner, while her driver swore at the carts, in which he found himself hopelessly entangled. It is Cinderella coming home without her slipper," said Claude, with a smile. The two men talked a little as they lounged through the market. Claude, with his hands in his pockets, told how much he enjoyed seeing all this abundance which poured into Paris every morning. He said he never came without his imagination being filled with wonderful pictures, of which he had yet begun only one. He had made Marjolin and Cadine sit for him, but the deuce of it all was, that these vegetables, fruits, meat and fish, were mighty hard things to paint. Florent listened, while the pangs of hunger were devouring him, to this enthusiasm. It was plain that Claude at this moment did not think of these things as eatable — he liked them for their beauty and color. Claude suddenly stopped and tightened, in a way that was common with him, the wide leather belt he wore under his old overcoat, and said, with a knowing air : Sometimes my only breakfast is through my eyes, and when I have neglected to dine the evening before, this sort of breakfast does not agree with me." He then went on to describe a supper for which a friend had once paid at Baratte's. They had had oysters, fish, and game; but Barate had come to grief. He and the old Marché des Innocents were done for together. This vast Halles was a very poor substitute for the past. Florent did not know whether the artist most regretted the loss of what was picturesque, or the good cheer that once was to be got at Barate's. Claude was now launched. He delivered a fiery vituperation of all the old masters. His cabbages, he declared, were better than all their dingy rags. He ended by accusing himself of miserable mannerism in the study he had made of la Rue Pirouette. I tell you," he said, a man should paint what he sees and as he sees it. Now look there," he continued, is not that a better picture than their consumptive saints?" Women were selling coffee and soup. A small crowd of customers had gathered around a large kettle of cabbage soup which smoked on a tiny brazier. The woman, armed with a long ladle, first put into a yellow bowl thin slices of bread, which she took from a basket covered with a napkin, and then filled up the bowl with soup. There were clean market gardeners in blouses; dirty porters with their shoulders soiled by the burthens they had carried, poor devils in rags; in short, all sorts of persons, eating their breakfast and scalding themselves with the hot soup. The painter was delighted, and half shut his eyes to compose his picture. But the smell of the cabbage soup was terribly strong. Florent turned away his head, the sight of the appetizing bowls made him dizzy, and even Claude was affected. He tightened his belt with a smile, but he was a little vexed, and walked on, saying as he did so, in a low voice, to Florent: It is very funny, but did you ever notice that there are always plenty of people ready to pay for a drink for you? But no one ever thinks of such a thing as paying for your food." It was now dawn. At the end of la Rue de la Cossonnerie, the houses in the Boulevard Sebastopol were black, and above their slated roofs stretched a line of light. Claude was looking up with his eyes fixed on a roof over his head. What are you looking for?" asked Florent. For that devil of a Marjolin," answered the painter. I need him for a study. He is certainly up there, unless he has seen fit to spend the night in a cellar with the poultry." And he went on to say how his friend Marjolin always lived about the market, of which he knew every nook and corner — he and that little scamp of a Cadine, whom Mother Chantemesse had picked up one night in the old Marche des Innocents. He was a splendid great fellow, with a ruddy beard which would have gladdened the heart of Rubens; while she was a tiny creature with a quaint little face and bright eyes under a wilderness of curly hair. Claude, as he talked, increased his pace. He led his companion to the Pointe Saint Eustache, where he dropped on a bench near the omnibus station. A ray of light suffused the eastern sky, which overhead was sombre and gray; and the air had such aromatic freshness that Florent could fancy himself on a hillside, in the country. Claude pointed out to him the secret of this odor. Thyme and lavender, sweet marjoram, and basil were all around him, done up in bundles ready for sale. The illuminated dial of Saint Eustache was slowly fading, while in the wine shops the gas burners were being extinguished one by one. And Florent watched the Halles emerge from the shadow, stretching their endless length before him, and when the daylight brought them entirely into view they struck him as a wonderful machine, the result of modern ingenuity — a gigantic cauldron made of wood, metal and glass. Claude stood upon a bench and insisted on his companion admiring the light as it streamed over the vegetables, bringing out all their rich tints and varied shades of green. The cabbages alone were a study for an artist. Enormous white cabbages, hard and compact, as if made of metal; curled cabbages with leaves like bronze; red cabbages with streaks of rich purple and crimson. In the distance the opening to la Rue Rambuteau was barred by a barricade of orange colored pumpkins, and the glossy reddish brown of a basket of onions, the vivid red of a pile of tomatoes, the yellowish tone of a quantity of cucumbers, the sombre violet of the egg plants, delighted the heart of the artist, who called these vegetables simply sublime. Meanwhile the crowd of white caps and blue blouses filled the narrow paths. Porters lifted their burthens high above their heads. There was a soldier and several nuns buying cabbages, and stout cooks were peering about in search of bargains, and the carts were still roaring up the street. Is it not magnificent?" cried Claude. But Florent was in an agony of pain. He looked up at Saint Eustache, of which he saw the sides, like sepia tracings against the blue sky. He saw the beautiful windows, the bell tower and the slated roof. He caught the gleam of gold lettered signs in la Rue Montmartre, down which workmen in white blouses, with their tools under their arms, were hurrying. Claude was still standing on the bench. Suddenly he beheld in the crowd a head he knew. "Ah, Marjolin! Cadine!" he cried. His voice was lost in the uproar, and he jumped down to follow his friends, but suddenly remembering Florent, he said, quickly : "You will find me in the Impasse des Bourdonnais. My name is on the door — Claude Lantier. Come and see my sketch of la Rue Pirouette." He disappeared. He did not know Florent's name. He left him, as he had taken him, on the curbstone, having explained his artistic preferences. Florent was now alone. At first he was glad of it. Since Madame Fran9ois had picked him up in the Avenue de Neuilly he had been simply half awake, and yet in such pain that he had hardly known what he was doing. At last he was free, and he tried to rid himself of the intolerable and heavy dream of mountains of food by which he felt himself pursued. But his head had a strangely empty feeling. He was a little afraid withal, for he could now be seen. His clothing was lamentable. He buttoned up his coat, brushed his pantaloons, fearing that their very dust would betray whence he came. He was seated by the side of several other poor devils on a bench which was kept in view by several policemen, who were walking up and down. Florent fancied that they knew him and were about to arrest him. He felt a mad desire to run, but he did not dare to move, nor had he the smallest idea where he should go. But he felt that he could no longer endure this cold examination of these men, and left the bench, not hurriedly, but as quietly as possible, feeling in imagination rough hands laid upon his collar. He had but one desire now, and that was to get away from Les Halles. But the streets were all so crowded that he did not know which to take. Wherever he turned his path was encumbered by the vegetables, while the pavement was slippery with the leaves of artichokes and lettuce. He heard the noise from the Halles. It was like a great central organ furiously beating, throwing the blood of life through all its veins. He went into a quiet covered street at the left, which he had previously noticed as especially quiet; but it was now as noisy and bustling as the others. He went to the very end, where he found cages of living poultry and baskets of dressed fowls. On the opposite sidewalk were carts discharging whole calves and calves in quarters, sheep and quarters of beef. Butchers with white aprons were weighing and cutting up the meat. He looked at them with wild, hungry eyes. He passed the stall where tripe was sold, and the feet and heads of calves, with the brains delicately placed in flat baskets, sweetbreads and kidneys. Florent, with sullen rage in his heart, turned away from this place. His teeth chattered, and he was afraid he should fall on the ground, and be picked up and carried off by the police. He stopped and leaned against a tree, with his eyes closed, and a strange buzzing in his ears. The raw carrot he had swallowed gripped his stomach, and the glass of punch intoxicated him. He was drunk with despair, fatigue and hunger. A great fire burned within his breast. He pressed his two hands upon it, as if to stop a hole through which his life was ebbing. The sidewalk upheaved under his feet when he tried once more to walk. He staggered, and finally, in a stupor, allowed himself to be pushed first in one direction and then in another. He was now ready to beg, and angry with himself at his foolish pride in rejecting the alms offered by Madame Fran9ois, and he was vexed also that he had not asked the painter to give him something; for now there was no one to whom he could turn. He was left there like a lost dog. He looked toward the Halles once more. They were now bright with the blaze of the rising sun; the zinc roof reflected the light. Blinded and dizzy, he wondered if he were to die in the face of all this plenty. Hot tears stood in his eyes. Two women now passed him, a little old woman and a taller one. And you come yourself to market. Mademoiselle Saget?" asked the taller and younger of the two. Oh, Madame Lecoeur, my marketing is nothing. You know what one woman lives on is nothing. I wanted a little cauliflower, but they are so dear. And butter — how much do they ask for it to day
34 sous. I have some very good. Suppose you try some." "I don't know. I have a little on hand." Florent made a great effort, and followed these women. He remembered that he had heard the smaller one mentioned by Claude, and said to himself that he would speak to her as soon as she was alone. "And your niece?" asked Mademoiselle Saget. "La Sarriette has her own way," answered Madame Lecoeur, sharply. "The day will come that she will turn to me for a mouthful of bread, but she will ask in vain." "You were very good to her, always." "She ought to make money, for fruits are very advantageous this year. And your brother in law?" "Oh, he —" Madame Lecoeur pinched up her lips, and seemed determined to say no more. "Always the same, I suppose," continued Mademoiselle Saget. "But he is a good man, after all; though it is a pity that he wastes his money in such a way." "How does he waste his money?" answered Madame Lecoeur, fiercely. "He is a miser, I tell you, and a thief, too. He would let me starve rather than give me a 5-franc piece. He knows perfectly well that I have made no money this year, while he has sold all the poultry he could get hold of; but he has never once offered me the smallest assistance — not that I would have accepted it, you understand." "Ah, here he comes," said Mademoiselle Saget, lowering her voice. The two women turned and looked at a man who was crossing the street. "I am in a hurry," said Madame Lecoeur. "I left my stall without any one, and besides, I do not wish to speak to him." Florent looked around mechanically. He saw a small, squarely built man, with rather a happy face, holding under each arm a fat goose. He started, looked again, and started in pursuit of this man. When he reached him, he touched him on his shoulder. "Gavard!" he said. The other looked up in some surprise at this long, black figure which accosted him. Then he uttered a stifled exclamation. "You!" he cried. "You here?" He nearly let his fat geese slip from his grasp; but seeing his sister and Mademoiselle Saget watching this meeting with evident curiosity, he walked on, saying : "Do not stop here, there are too many eyes and ears." They found a quiet corner and talked. Florent said he had been to la Rue Pirouette. Gavard thought this very queer. He laughed, and said that Quenu had moved, and opened his pork shop in la Rue Rambuteau, opposite the Halles. He was still more amused when he discovered that Florent had been all the morning with Claude Lantier, a droll sort of fellow who was, moreover, the nephew of Madame Quenu. He would show Florent where the pork shop was. But when Gavard found that his friend had returned to Paris with forged papers, he shook his head with an air of grave disapproval. He insisted on going a little in front, as they walked, that they might not attract attention. He passed his stall and hung up his two fat geese; and still followed by Florent, he crossed la Rue Rambuteau, where he pointed to a showy pork shop, past which the army of street sweepers were just moving, with regular strokes of their brooms. The pork shop was almost on the corner of la Rue Pirouette. It was a pleasure to look at, being so bright and clean. The sign, on which was the name Quenu Gradelle, in long gilt letters on a pale blue ground, was worthy of being covered with glass. Cupids sported amid wreaths of sausages and piles of cutlets. The window was a mass of green. Each plate was surrounded by parsley and celery. In the background were jars of pickles and pots of mustard. There were hams and tongues and pigs' feet, black puddings and forcemeat balls, sausages and pâtés, hams in jelly, and large pâtés. There were truffles and mushrooms. There were boxes of tunny fish and sardines. A box of rich Neufchatel cheeses in one corner, and in the other fat little snails lay among parsley. On the rear shelf of this chapel, consecrated to the stomach, between two tall bouquets of purple gladioli, was a square aquarium wherein two goldfish were disporting. Florent shivered. He saw a woman standing in the doorway. She gave another touch of beauty to all this solid comfort. She was a beautiful woman, full but not too stout, in all the maturity of her 30 years. She had just risen, and her shining hair was smooth and massive. Her flesh had that transparent whiteness, that delicacy common to the skin of persons who live on buttermilk and fat meat. She was grave and serious in expression. Her stiff linen collar lay smooth about her throat.
Her white sleeves came up to her elbows, and her white apron down nearly to her shoes, leaving only the extreme edge of her black dress to be seen, and its tight fitting waist. She stood bathed in the sunshine, drinking in the beauty of the morning. She had a look of great kindliness. That is your brother's wife, your sister in law, Lisa," said Gavard to Florent. He nodded to the woman as he spoke; then turned into an alley, taking the most preposterous precautions, although the shop was empty, and was evidently delighted to be concerned in an adventure which he regarded as somewhat compromising. Wait," he said, I am going to see if your brother is alone. You must not go in until I clap my hands." He pushed a door open in the alley, but when Florent heard his brother's voice, he could restrain himself no longer, but rushed in. Quenu, who adored him, advanced with open arms. They embraced each other as if they had been children. Ah !" stammered Quenu, and I thought you dead. Only just now I was saying to Lisa that poor Florent —" He stopped and put his head into the shop. Lisa! Lisa!" Then turning to a little girl in the corner, he said : Pauline, go ask your mother to come here." But the child did not move. She was a magnificent little creature, about 5 years old, and looking very much like her mother. She held tight in her plump little arms an enormous yellow cat, as if afraid that this shabby new comer would steal her treasure. Lisa came with slow and stately step. It is Florent, my brother," said Quenu. She called him Monsieur, and was very cordial. She examined him frankly from head to foot, but evinced no unkind surprise. Her lips were, however, slightly compressed, but they finally parted in a smile as she witnessed her husband's ecstasy of delight. But he suddenly became grave, seeming to realize Florent's careworn aspect and his excessive thinness. Ah ! my poor dear boy," he said, you have not grown fat. Now look at me." He was fat, certainly, too fat for his 30 years. He seemed to be bursting out of his shirt and the great white apron in which he was swathed. His well shorn face had gained a certain resemblance to that of a pig, in the flesh of which animals' hands were busy all day long. Florent would hardly have recognized him. He seated himself and looked from his brother to Lisa, and then to little Pauline. They were all in riotous health, and gazed at him with all the astonishment of stout persons at excessive thinness. The very cat winked her yellow eyes, and examined him with evident distrust. Will you wait awhile for breakfast?" asked Quenu, or will you have something now? Our hour is 10." Florent thought of the terrible night he had passed, of his agony, and of the incessant sight of the abundance of which he could not partake, and said in a low voice, with a sweet smile : I am very hungry." CHAPTER II.